The heavy oak door to the master suite didn't creak, but the silence inside was louder than any scream. Nora Rourke stood in the threshold, watching her husband's tattooed hand tangled in her sister's hair. In the bed she'd paid for, in the house she'd built, and she didn't say a single word. Because the woman who'd just been betrayed was the same woman who controlled every bank account, every shipping route, every piece of leverage that made her husband's $50 million empire possible. And he had no idea what was about to happen next. Before we go deeper into the story, you are welcome to Empire Stories. We're building a community that refuses to accept neglect and betrayal as normal. If you believe women deserve respect, loyalty, and real love, not control disguised as protection, subscribe and help us get to 10,000 subscribers. Your support helps us spread these stories to people who need to know. They deserve better, and it's okay to walk away. The master suite door stood wide open when Nora Rourke returned to her Manchester estate at 10:23 on a Thursday evening, 3 days earlier than scheduled from a logistics conference in Boston. She had been finalizing contracts for the Rourke family's expansion into Canadian timber routes, the intricate legal frameworks and shipping manifests that no one else in the organization understood well enough to execute. Outside, January wind rattled the old colonial windows, the kind of bone-deep New Hampshire cold that made even hardened men hurry indoors. But inside the house, the silence felt wrong, thick and deliberate, like the pause before an avalanche. The light from the bedroom doorway cast a warm rectangle across the hardwood floor she'd had refinished last spring, the same honeyed glow from the antique brass lamps she'd found at an estate sale in Portsmouth. Nora stood in the hallway, her wool coat still buttoned against the cold, her leather portfolio case gripped in one hand, and through that open doorway she could see everything with the clarity of a courtroom photograph. Caleb's hand, the one decorated with tattoos that told the story of every territory he'd claimed, every rival he'd buried, was buried in dark hair that fell differently than Nora's, longer and wilder. The white silk slip tangled in the sheets belonged to Vera, the woman who had sat across from Nora at Sunday dinners for 26 years, who had borrowed money Nora always forgave, who had asked pointed questions about the Rourke finances while laughing about how boring Nora's work must be. The sheets themselves, Italian linen in deep charcoal, were the ones Nora had ordered for their bedroom renovation 4 months ago. She didn't make a sound. Her breathing didn't change. She reached into her coat pocket with fingers that had signed corporate documents worth $40 million and retrieved her phone. One photograph, taken with the clinical detachment of an evidence technician. No flash to announce her presence. No shutter sound to break the tableau. Just documentation, precise and damning. Then she stepped fully into the doorway. They separated like guilty children caught stealing, which she supposed was accurate enough. Vera lunged for the sheets, her performance of seduction collapsing into raw panic. Caleb rose from the bed, reaching for the pants he draped over the leather armchair, his other hand rising toward Nora in a gesture that somehow managed to be both apologetic and commanding. His expression moved through stages, shock crystallizing into calculation, calculation hardening into the cold menace she'd watched him turn on business rivals who'd made the mistake of crossing him. "Nora, this isn't," he started, his voice carrying that dangerous edge. "I hope she was worth it," Nora interrupted, her voice quiet enough that he had to strain to hear it. No tremor, no rage, nothing he could use as leverage to dismiss her as hysterical. She was already turning away, her mind already racing 3 moves ahead, assembling the sequence of actions she would need to execute with surgical precision. "Where the hell do you think you're going?" Caleb's voice dropped into that register she'd heard him use before making people disappear, the tone that made experienced criminals reconsider their life choices. Nora paused at the threshold, glanced back once with dark eyes that were disturbingly calm, almost clinical, like a surgeon identifying exactly where to make the incision. "To the safe house in the White Mountains. I need to access the servers." "You're upset?" Caleb said, his voice shifting to that patronizing gentleness that always preceded his dismissals. "We'll discuss this tomorrow after you've had time to think clearly. Don't do anything you'll regret." Nora didn't argue. She walked away, her boots striking the hardwood floor with rhythmic certainty, each step carrying her further from the marriage she'd maintained and closer to the systematic dismantling of everything he believed he controlled. By Monday morning at 6:47 a.m., the Rourke empire was bleeding from wounds no one could identify or cauterize. The first call came to Dutch Kellerman, Caleb's operations manager, about the timber trucks stalled at the Portsmouth docks due to missing customs documentation. Then to Ray Blanchard about the shipping company's operating accounts showing error messages. Then to 4 different legitimate business managers facing simultaneous audit notifications from the New Hampshire Department of Revenue. The messages multiplied like a contagion spreading through every branch of the organization. Payroll systems locked. Shell corporations showing dissolution paperwork filed electronically. Federal asset seizure warrants appearing for properties that should have been invisible to law enforcement. And every single thread, when traced back to its source, revealed one truth that Caleb Rourke had never bothered to acknowledge. His wife wasn't just the woman who handled paperwork. She was the architect. She was the infrastructure. She was the invisible genius who had transformed a violent man with territorial ambition into a $50 million empire that controlled New Hampshire's shipping corridors. Nora had built the entire kingdom. Caleb thought he ruled it. Every offshore account required her authorization. Every shell corporation bore her encrypted signature. Every protection from federal oversight was structured through her legal frameworks. Every legitimate business front was her meticulous creation. For 12 years, she had made him powerful while remaining invisible, reducing her own brilliance so he could feel like the mastermind who'd conquered the North Country through force and cunning. And when she walked out that bedroom door Thursday night, she had already begun executing Protocol 7, the fail-safe sequence she'd built into every system, the one that would systematically transfer power away from him with the same precision she'd used to consolidate it in his name. Not just the money, not just the infrastructure. She was removing the very foundation of his power and triggering its methodical collapse with the same clinical efficiency she'd used to construct it. Caleb tried calling her Friday morning. Disconnected. He sent 2 of his most trusted men to find her Saturday. They returned empty-handed, reporting that the White Mountain property was locked down with security they couldn't breach. By Sunday afternoon, when his attorney called about the federal investigation with evidence that shouldn't exist, documents bearing Caleb's signature on every illegal kickback, every bribe, every tax evasion scheme, he finally understood what she'd been trying to tell him. It was never his empire. It was always hers. She had simply allowed him to believe otherwise. The safe house sat 40 minutes north of Conway, accessible only by a private road that didn't appear on any map Caleb had ever seen. Nora had purchased the property 3 years ago under a shell corporation he didn't know existed, the same way she'd acquired 6 other assets he'd never thought to ask about. The structure itself was modest, a renovated hunting lodge with reinforced doors and a server room in the basement that ran on independent power generators. She arrived at 11:47 Thursday night, unlocked the biometric security panel, and descended the stairs to begin the work that would take 72 hours of uninterrupted focus. In Manchester, Caleb woke Friday morning to an empty house and assumed exactly what Nora knew he would assume, that she'd run away to lick her wounds like every other woman he'd ever made cry. He called her phone twice, got the disconnected message both times, and decided she'd thrown it away in a fit of emotion. Typical. Dramatic. He'd give her the weekend to realize how foolish she was being, how much she needed him, how impossible her life would be without the Rourke name protecting her. By Friday afternoon, he was holding court at the Foundry on Commercial Street, the upscale restaurant where he conducted business over $40 steaks and bourbon that cost more than most people's car payments. His usual table in the back corner gave him a clear view of the entrance and enough privacy for conversations that couldn't happen in offices with security cameras. Dutch Kellerman sat across from him, reviewing the week's shipping manifests, while Ray Blanchard updated him on a territorial dispute with a Boston crew trying to move product through Portsmouth. "Any word from Nora?" Dutch asked carefully. The kind of question a loyal employee asks when he's genuinely concerned but doesn't want to overstep. Caleb cut into his ribeye with more force than necessary. She'll be back by Monday. She's hiding somewhere, crying about Vera, making me feel guilty. It's what women do. What would you do if you discovered your partner had been the secret architect of everything you thought you'd built yourself? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Ray shifted uncomfortably. Should we be worried about, she handles a lot of the paperwork, the accounts, and she handles what I tell her to handle, Caleb interrupted, his voice carrying that edge that made men stop asking questions. She's good with numbers, I'll give her that, but she's not stupid enough to actually do anything. She knows what happens to people who cross me. He laughed then, that confident bark of a man who'd never considered that power could exist in forms he couldn't see or intimidate. His men laughed with him because that's what men did when Caleb Rourke made a joke. None of them noticed the waiter's expression, the slight pause before he refilled their water glasses, the way he pulled out his phone in the kitchen and sent a text message to a number that would route through 3 encrypted servers before reaching Nora's screen in the White Mountains. The message was simple. He thinks you're crying. Nora read it on one of her 6 monitors, her fingers never pausing in their work as line after line of code executed the commands she'd spent 3 years preparing for a day she'd hoped would never come. She didn't smile. She didn't feel vindicated. She simply flagged the message as received and continued dismantling her husband's empire with the same methodical precision a surgeon uses to remove a tumor, careful to extract every cell so nothing malignant remains. By Saturday morning, the first symptoms would appear. By Sunday, Caleb would realize he wasn't dealing with a crying wife. But what he still wouldn't understand, what he couldn't understand until it was far too late, was that the woman he'd betrayed had already done something far worse than leave him. She'd made him disappear while he was still sitting at his table, still laughing, still believing he was untouchable. Protocol 7 had existed in the Rourke logistics system for 2 years and 11 months. Buried so deep in the software architecture that even the IT contractor Nora had hired to maintain the servers didn't know it was there. She'd written it during a weekend in February when Caleb had gone to Atlantic City with his crew, coding through the night with the kind of focus that came from acknowledging an uncomfortable truth, that someday she might need an exit that didn't involve a body bag or witness protection. Saturday morning at 6:15 a.m., sitting in the server room with 3 monitors displaying real-time data feeds from every Rourke operation, Nora entered the 48-character activation code. No confirmation dialogue appeared asking if she was sure. She'd designed it that way deliberately. Hesitation was a luxury she couldn't afford. The first domino fell at the Portsmouth shipping docks where 6 Rourke timber trucks sat loaded with Canadian lumber worth $200,000. The digital manifests that should have cleared customs suddenly showed discrepancies. Weight measurements that didn't match, origin certifications that referenced non-existent mills, tariff codes that triggered automatic federal review. The trucks weren't going anywhere. Not today. Not this month. Possibly not ever, depending on how thoroughly the inspectors decided to investigate. The second sequence executed at 7:23 a.m., rerouting a convoy of 3 trucks carrying premium timber to a Boston construction contract worth $500,000. The GPS coordinates in the system shifted by exactly 47 miles, sending the drivers to an address in rural Maine where a very confused dairy farmer would spend his morning explaining to angry truckers that he definitely hadn't ordered any lumber. By 9 a.m., the Rourke Logistics Center in Manchester was fielding 17 separate crisis calls. Shipments missing, deliveries to wrong addresses, digital payment authorizations failing, insurance certificates showing as expired. Every single transaction that moved through the custom software Nora had built from the ground up was now executing with surgical errors, each one small enough to seem like a technical glitch but catastrophic enough to halt business completely. Dutch Kellerman called Caleb at 9:47, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "We've got a situation. The entire system's gone haywire. Nothing's moving. Portsmouth says customs flagged all our trucks. Boston's threatening to cancel contracts. I've got drivers calling me from the middle of nowhere saying their GPS sent them to the wrong state." "Caleb, still in bed with Vera sprawled beside him, felt the first cold finger of unease trace down his spine. It's a computer problem. Call the IT guy. Have him fix it. He can't access the system. Says he needs Nora's authorization codes to make changes to the core software. The silence on the line stretched long enough that Dutch thought the call had dropped. Find her, Caleb said finally, his voice dropping into that dangerous register. I don't care if you have to check every hotel from here to Boston. Find my wife and bring her back. If you're loving this story, hit that like button. We're just getting started. What Dutch didn't know, what Caleb was only beginning to suspect, was that finding Nora Rourke was going to be the least of their problems. Because while they were searching for her, she was already 3 moves ahead, executing the next phase of a plan that would make their current crisis look like a minor inconvenience. The trucks at Portsmouth weren't just stuck. They were evidence. And by Monday morning, federal investigators were going to be very interested in what they found inside those manifests that Nora had so carefully restructured to tell a very specific story. One where Caleb's signature appeared on every illegal transaction, while hers appeared nowhere at all. The call came Sunday afternoon at 2:34 p.m., Vera's number flashing on the burner phone Nora kept for family contacts. Nora watched it ring 4 times before answering, her finger already hovering over the recording application she'd activated 2 seconds earlier. Nora? Vera's voice cracked with the kind of manufactured emotion she'd always been good at producing. Thank God. I've been trying to reach you for days. We need to talk about what happened. Nora said nothing. She simply held the phone to her ear, her other hand moving across the keyboard as she continued working through the next sequence of Protocol 7. On the monitor in front of her, she watched real-time alerts from the Rourke family trust accounts, the ones established by Caleb's grandfather with strict morality clauses that could trigger immediate divestment under specific circumstances. Are you there? Vera asked, the desperation in her voice edging toward anger. Look, I know what you saw looked bad, but you have to understand, Caleb and we didn't plan this. It just happened. You're always so busy with your work, always so cold and distant. He needed someone who actually saw him. The justification was predictable, almost scripted. Nora had heard variations of this speech in a dozen different contexts. Family members explaining why they'd borrowed money they never intended to repay, why they'd missed important events, why their failures were somehow always someone else's responsibility. He's losing everything, Nora, Vera continued, her voice shifting to pleading. The business is falling apart. He says you did something to the computers. You have to fix this. He's family. I'm your sister. Blood is thicker than. Is it? Nora asked quietly, the first words she'd spoken since answering. The question hung in the air like a blade suspended by a thread. Is blood thicker? Nora repeated, her voice carrying none of the emotion Vera had probably expected. Because I remember lending you $40,000 3 years ago when you claimed your gallery was going under. I remember the trust fund grandfather set up for both of us that you burned through in 18 months while mine still generates income. I remember every Sunday dinner where you asked pointed questions about the Rourke finances while laughing about how boring my life must be. So tell me, Vera, when exactly was blood thicker for you? The silence on the other end was absolute. You're recording this, aren't you? Vera whispered finally, the calculation replacing the tears in her voice. Yes, Nora said simply. Every word. Including the part where you just confirmed your affair with my husband and your knowledge of the family trust's existence. The same trust that has a morality clause specifically prohibiting actions that bring disgrace to the family name. Affairs with married family members qualify, as does knowingly participating in the destruction of family assets. Can you imagine discovering that even your own blood would betray you for someone else's empire? What do you want? Vera's voice had gone flat, all pretense abandoned. I want you to understand something, Nora said, closing the file on her screen that contained the complete audio recording, time-stamped and encrypted. Caleb's empire isn't falling apart because of a computer glitch. It's collapsing because it was never his to begin with. And the trust fund you've been living off of? That's about to collapse too. I'm the executor, Vera. I always have been. Grandfather knew exactly which one of us could be trusted with that responsibility. She ended the call before Vera could respond, then immediately uploaded the recording to 3 separate secure servers, each one linked to automatic distribution protocols that would activate if she failed to input a cancellation code every 72 hours. Insurance, in case Caleb decided that his computer problems could be solved by making his wife have an accident. But Vera's call had given her something more valuable than just evidence. It had confirmed what Nora had suspected, that Caleb was finally starting to understand this wasn't a technical failure he could fix by hiring better IT support. He was beginning to realize he was in a fight. What he still didn't grasp, what men like him never grasped until it was far too late, was that he'd brought a gun to a chess match and his opponent had already calculated every possible move he could make. By the time he figured out the rules of the game she was playing, she'd have already won. The encrypted email arrived at the New Hampshire Attorney General's office at 3:47 a.m. Monday morning, routed through 7 different proxy servers spanning 4 countries before landing in the inbox of a senior investigator who'd been building a case against organized crime in the shipping industry for 3 years. The subject line was simple: Rourke Shipping. Complete financial records 2019 to 2025. The files contained everything. Kickback payments to port inspectors with Caleb's signature on the authorization forms. Bribes to customs officials documented in meticulous spreadsheets that showed payment amounts, dates, and the specific shipments that had been waved through without proper inspection. Shell corporation structures that existed solely to launder money from legitimate timber sales into offshore accounts. Every single incorporation document bearing Caleb's notarized signature. Tax evasion schemes that had saved the Rourke organization millions while funding expansion into territories that should have belonged to competing families. What the files didn't contain was equally important. Nora's name appeared nowhere except as a W-2 employee receiving a modest salary for administrative support. Every partnership agreement, every bank authorization, every document that could implicate her in criminal activity had been meticulously restructured over the past 6 months. She'd known this day might come long before she'd found Caleb in bed with Vera. She'd simply been waiting for the right moment to pull the trigger. The investigator who opened the email at 7:15 a.m. spent 40 minutes reviewing the contents before walking directly to his supervisor's office. By 9 a.m., 4 assistant attorneys general were assembled in a conference room, cross-referencing the leaked documents against their existing case files. By 10:30 a.m., they'd confirmed that the financial records matched perfectly with suspicious transactions they'd been tracking but could never prove. By noon, federal warrants were being drafted. Caleb received the call from his attorney at 1:23 p.m. He was back at the foundry, trying to manage the logistics crisis that had now entered its 3rd day, when his phone lit up with the number he paid $15,000 a month to keep on retainer. "Don't say anything specific," James Pritchard said without preamble. "Just listen. The AG's office has files. Everything. Bribes, kickbacks, tax fraud. Your signature is on documents I didn't even know existed. They're drafting warrants. You need to come to my office immediately, and you need to not talk to anyone before you get here." Caleb's hand tightened around the phone hard enough that the glass screen cracked. How did they get the files? Anonymous tip. Encrypted. Untraceable. Professional-level work. Pritchard paused, and in that silence, Caleb heard the answer to the question he was afraid to ask. Caleb, who has access to your financial records? Who would know where everybody is buried? The restaurant suddenly felt too hot, the walls pressing in. Caleb thought about Nora sitting in that server room wherever she'd disappeared to, her fingers moving across keyboards with the same precision she'd used to build his empire. He thought about every document he'd signed without reading because she told him it was routine, every authorization he'd approved because she'd explained it was necessary for tax purposes, every shell corporation he'd never bothered to investigate because handling that kind of detail work was beneath him. "She wouldn't," he said, but his voice carried no conviction. "Who wouldn't?" Pritchard asked. Caleb didn't answer. He ended the call and sat staring at the cracked screen of his phone, finally understanding that the woman he'd betrayed hadn't just left him. She'd built him a cage out of his own signatures, his own greed, his own assumption that power could only be measured in violence and fear. And now that cage was closing around him while she remained completely outside its reach, watching from a distance as everything he thought he'd built revealed itself to be nothing more than a structure she'd designed to collapse at precisely the moment she decided it should. The question wasn't whether the authorities would come for him. The question was what else she'd put in motion that he didn't know about yet, what other traps were waiting to spring the moment he thought he'd found a way out. Tuesday evening at the foundry should have been routine. Caleb sat at his usual table with Dutch and Ray flanking him. Along with two newer associates he was grooming for collection work. His security detail, Thomas Burke and Leo Castillo, stood at strategic positions near the entrance and the kitchen, the same positions they'd occupied every Tuesday for the past 4 years. Everything looked exactly as it should, which was precisely why Caleb didn't notice the trap closing until it was too late. They ordered the way they always did, ribeyes, bourbon, the kind of meal that announced you were a man who could afford excess. Caleb was in the middle of explaining his theory, that Nora had panicked and done something stupid with the computers, but would eventually crawl back once she realized she had nowhere else to go, when Dutch's phone buzzed with an alert from the emergency operations line. 3 more shipments rerouted, Dutch said quietly, his face pale. That's 15 in total. We've got clients threatening to sue for breach of contract. She's bluffing, Caleb said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. She doesn't have the spine to actually burn everything down. She's trying to scare me into negotiations. The server arrived with the check, placing it discreetly beside Caleb's elbow. He reached for his platinum card without looking, the same automatic gesture he'd made 1,000 times before. The server returned 3 minutes later with an expression that was carefully neutral in the way service industry professionals learn when dealing with uncomfortable situations. Sir, this card was declined. Do you have another form of payment? The table went silent. Caleb pulled out a second card, then a third. All declined. He opened his banking app with fingers that had started to tremble and stared at the balance display. $0. His business account showed the same. The emergency reserve account he kept for exactly this kind of situation. $0. There's been a mistake, he said, but his voice sounded hollow even to himself. Ray tried his own card to cover the bill, but it declined as well. Dutch reached for his wallet and found the same result. The server stood there, professional sympathy warring with growing concern, while 5 men who controlled a $50 million criminal empire couldn't pay for their dinner. That's when Thomas and Leo's phones buzzed simultaneously. Caleb watched them both glance at their screens, saw something pass between them. A look of calculation, of opportunity recognized, before Thomas walked over to the table. "We're done here," Thomas said simply. "What?" Caleb's voice carried a dangerous edge. "We just got a better offer. 50% raise, immediate start, full benefits." "Sorry, boss. It's just business." They walked out together, leaving Caleb sitting at a table he couldn't pay for, surrounded by associates who were realizing that the man they'd feared for a decade couldn't even access his own money. The other diners had started to notice the commotion. Phones coming out, whispers spreading through the restaurant like wildfire. Do you think loyalty can be bought? Or was Thomas right that it's just business? Caleb's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Table 6 sends her regards." He looked across the restaurant to Table 6, where a young woman sat alone with a laptop, her face carefully neutral as she watched him. She wasn't Nora, but she worked for Nora, which meant Nora was watching this exact moment unfold, watching him realize that she hadn't just taken his money. She'd taken his reputation, his security, his appearance of power. She'd reduced him to a man who couldn't pay his own restaurant bill in front of witnesses who would spread this story to every corner of the New Hampshire underworld by morning. The manager approached carefully. "Sir, we can work out a payment arrangement if—" "Get the hell away from me," Caleb snarled, but the threat rang hollow now. What was he going to do? Beat up a restaurant manager while dozens of people filmed it on their phones? He stood abruptly, knocking his chair back, and walked out of the foundry for what he didn't yet realize would be the last time. Behind him, Dutch and Ray scrambled to follow, leaving the unpaid check on the table like evidence at a crime scene. Outside in the cold Manchester night, Caleb pulled out his phone and called the one number he'd been avoiding all week. It rang once before going to voicemail. Nora's voice, calm and professional. "You've reached Nora Rourke. I'm unavailable. Don't leave a message." But she wasn't unavailable. She was very much available, watching every move he made, orchestrating his destruction with such precision that he was only beginning to understand how completely she'd outmaneuvered him. And tomorrow morning, when he woke up to discover what she'd done next, he'd realize that losing his money and his guards wasn't the endgame. It was barely even the beginning. Vera's key no longer worked in the Manchester estate's front door. She discovered this Wednesday afternoon when she arrived with 2 suitcases and the expectation that she'd be moving into the master suite permanently now that Nora was gone. She tried the key 3 times before accepting reality. The locks had been changed. She called Caleb and got voicemail. She called again and again. He finally answered on the 6th attempt, his voice rough with exhaustion and something else. Something that might have been fear if Caleb Rourke were capable of such an emotion. "What do you want, Vera?" The coldness in his tone made her stomach drop. "I'm at the house. The key doesn't work. Can you let me in? I thought we could talk about—" "There's nothing to talk about. Go home." "Home?" She forced a laugh that came out brittle and desperate. "Caleb, I thought we were— after everything I assumed." "You assumed wrong." His voice carried that flat finality she'd heard him use on people right before cutting them loose. "You were convenient. That's all you were." The line went dead. Vera stood on the front steps of the estate she'd imagined herself ruling, her suitcases at her feet like monuments to her own stupidity. She tried the key one more time, knowing it wouldn't work, needing to do something with her hands to stop them from shaking. When that failed, she sat down on the cold stone steps and finally let herself think about what she'd actually done. She'd destroyed her relationship with the only person who'd never asked her for anything in return. Nora had loaned her money without judgment, had included her in family events even when Vera had been at her worst, had listened to her complaints about failed relationships and struggling businesses without ever saying what they both knew, that Vera's problems were always self-inflicted. And how had Vera repaid that loyalty? By sleeping with Nora's husband in Nora's bed, on sheets Nora had chosen, in a house Nora had made into a home. The call came Thursday morning at 7:47 a.m., a number Vera didn't recognize but answered anyway because she was desperate enough to take a call from anyone who might offer a lifeline. "Miss Rourke," a professional male voice, the kind that delivered bad news in accounting terms. "This is Richard Chun from Granite State Trust Management. I'm calling regarding your family trust fund. There's been a change in your distribution status." "What kind of change?" "Your monthly distributions have been suspended pending review of morality clause violations. As executor, Mrs. Nora Rourke has submitted evidence of conduct that violates the terms established by your grandfather. You have the right to contest this decision through—" Vera ended the call and immediately tried Nora's number. It went straight to a message that was somehow worse than voicemail. "This number is no longer in service." She tried twice more before accepting that Nora had cut her off as completely as Caleb just had. No money, no sister, no future that didn't involve explaining to everyone she knew how she'd burned her entire life down for a man who'd discarded her the moment she stopped being useful. Vera sat in her small apartment, the one Nora's money had been paying for, and opened her laptop to check her bank account. The balance showed enough to cover maybe 2 months of rent if she ate nothing but rice and gave up her gym membership and stopped buying coffee and wore the same 5 outfits until they fell apart. She traded everything for a man who'd valued her less than the sheets they'd ruined. Her phone buzzed with a text from a friend who'd seen the social media posts about Caleb's restaurant humiliation. "Is it true about Caleb? Are you okay?" She wasn't okay. She would never be okay again. because she'd finally understood what Nora had been trying to tell her on that recorded phone call. Blood should have been thicker, but Vera had thinned it herself, diluted it with jealousy and entitlement until there was nothing left but the consequences of her own choices. The worst part wasn't losing the money or the relationship with Caleb. The worst part was understanding that she'd lost the one person who would have helped her even after all of this, if only Vera had been capable of asking. But Nora was done helping people who'd proven they'd rather destroy her than appreciate her. And somewhere in a safe house in the White Mountains, Vera's sister was moving forward with her life, having surgically removed both of them from it with the same precision she'd used to remove Caleb's empire from his control. What Vera didn't know yet, what she'd discover when the final piece of Nora's plan fell into place, was that her humiliation was just collateral damage in a much larger operation, one that would reshape the entire New Hampshire criminal landscape and leave no trace of the Rourke family except the ghost of a woman who'd proven that the most dangerous power was the kind no one saw coming. The first incursion came Friday morning when a crew from Boston started operating protection rackets along the Portsmouth waterfront, territory that had belonged to the Rourke family for 2 decades. Word reached Caleb by noon, delivered by one of the few associates who hadn't abandoned him yet. By evening, 3 more reports confirmed what he'd been dreading. The vultures had smelled blood in the water and were circling. Saturday brought worse news. A Springfield crew had moved into Manchester's industrial district, collecting from businesses that had been paying Caleb for years. When Dutch tried to push back, to remind them whose territory they were violating, they'd laughed in his face and told him the Rourke organization was finished, that everyone knew Caleb was broke and being investigated by the feds. "We need to send a message," Ray said during the emergency meeting at a warehouse Caleb had thought was secure until he learned Nora owned the shell company that leased it. "Show them we're still dangerous." Caleb nodded, feeling the old familiar weight of violence settling over him like armor. This he understood. This he could control. "Get the weapons from the Nashua storage facility. We hit the Springfield crew tonight. Make an example." Dutch made the call, then went pale listening to the response. "Boss, the storage facility says they don't have any record of our rental agreement. The company that leased the space." "Let me guess," Caleb interrupted, bitter understanding flooding through him. "It doesn't exist anymore. Dissolved 6 days ago. All contents were removed by authorized personnel on Tuesday." The second weapons cache showed the same results. The third, the fourth. Every gun, every piece of equipment Caleb had accumulated over 15 years of operation had been purchased through companies Nora had created, companies that she'd systematically dissolved while simultaneously arranging for the contents to vanish into whatever void she'd prepared for them. He'd built his empire on violence, on the threat of force, on making people understand that crossing him meant consequences. And his wife had dismantled that empire by removing the very tools he'd used to build it, leaving him nothing but his reputation and his fists against crews that had automatic weapons and the confidence that came from knowing their target was defenseless. By Monday, 4 different Massachusetts organizations had established operations in what used to be Rourke territory. Caleb could do nothing but watch as his empire was carved up like a carcass, distributed among predators who'd waited years for exactly this opportunity. Every attempt to fight back failed because he had no weapons, no money to buy new ones, no credit because Nora had destroyed his financial reputation, and no leverage because everyone knew he was being investigated by federal authorities. He'd become a king without a kingdom, a warlord without weapons, a threat without teeth. And somewhere in the White Mountains, his wife was watching him learn the lesson she'd been trying to teach him all along. That violence was only power when backed by infrastructure, and infrastructure was only power when controlled by intelligence. He'd had the violence. She'd had everything else. And now that she'd taken it back, he had nothing but the approaching sound of sirens and the knowledge that his final reckoning was already in motion. The text message came Tuesday morning, simple and direct. "Lake Winnipesaukee, East Shore Marina, 2 p.m. Come alone." Caleb arrived 15 minutes early, scanning the parking lot for threats that never materialized. Nora was already there, standing at the end of a dock with her back to him, her dark coat stark against the winter water. She looked exactly as she had 2 weeks ago, composed and unreachable, as if she hadn't just systematically destroyed everything he'd spent 15 years building. "You came," he said, hating how his voice sounded desperate, diminished. "You asked." She didn't turn around. "What do you want, Caleb?" "The codes. The backup access to the systems. I know you built in failsafes. I'll give you whatever you want, the house, a settlement, anything. Just give me the codes so I can fix this." Now she turned, and the expression on her face was something he'd never seen before. Pity mixed with a terrible calm that made his skin crawl. "There are no codes," she said simply. "That's impossible. You're too smart to build a system without." "I built the system with one administrator," Nora interrupted. "Me. There was never a backup. There was never a failsafe. There was only you, believing you were in control because I let you believe it." The words hit him like physical blows. "Everything I built. Everything you thought you built," she corrected. "Let me explain how this actually worked. You made threats. You intimidated people. You created chaos. And I came behind you and turned that chaos into infrastructure. Every business contact you thought you'd secured through fear, I secured through legal contracts you never read. Every territory you thought you'd conquered through violence, I conquered through logistics agreements and shipping partnerships. You were never the architect, Caleb. You were the distraction. The loud, violent distraction that kept everyone looking at you while I built an empire that ran on intelligence, not bloodshed." "I loved you," he said, the words torn from somewhere deep and desperate. "No," Nora said, her voice impossibly gentle. "You loved what I could do for you. You loved having someone make you feel powerful while doing all the work you were too impatient to learn. You loved the idea of a wife who stayed quiet and invisible while you played king. But you never loved me enough to stay faithful. You never respected me enough to wonder why your empire ran so smoothly. And you never bothered to ask yourself what would happen if I stopped performing the miracle of making you look competent." He wanted to rage, to threaten, to do something that would make him feel powerful again. But standing there on that dock with the winter wind cutting through his inadequate jacket, looking at the woman who'd methodically dismantled his entire existence, he finally understood the full scope of what he'd lost. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now?" Nora checked her watch with the casual gesture of someone who had other appointments to keep. "Now you face the consequences of actions you signed your name to. The federal agents will arrest you Wednesday morning at the Portsmouth docks. They have enough evidence to ensure you'll spend the next 20 years in prison. Your associates have already scattered. Your territory belongs to people who are better organized than you ever were. And I remain exactly what I've always been, the invisible architect who built something real out of your delusions of grandeur." She walked past him toward the parking lot, pausing only when he called her name one last time. "Was any of it real?" he asked. "Our marriage, the 12 years. Was any of it real for you?" Nora looked back at him, and for just a moment, he saw something that might have been regret flicker across her face. "It was real," she said quietly, "until you made it impossible for it to be. Goodbye, Caleb." He watched her drive away, her car disappearing down the lakeside road, and wondered if she'd been lying about the federal agents coming Wednesday. Then he remembered that Nora had never lied to him. She'd simply never told him the whole truth. And by tomorrow morning, when he discovered exactly what she meant about facing consequences, he'd realize that their meeting at Lake Winnipesaukee wasn't mercy or closure. It was her allowing him one final moment to understand the full magnitude of his mistake before the walls closed in completely. The federal agents arrived at Portsmouth docks at 6:47 a.m. Wednesday morning, 18 vehicles forming a perimeter that left no possibility of escape. Caleb had gone there on instinct, drawn to the place where his empire had started, where his grandfather had first established the Rourke shipping presence decades ago. He'd spent the night walking among the containers and trucks, touching the infrastructure that he'd believed was his legacy, not yet accepting that it had never belonged to him at all. They called his name through a bullhorn. told him to put his hands where they could see them, read him his rights while pressing his face against the cold metal of a shipping container that bore the Rourke logo. A logo Nora had designed. He realized now, everything stamped with her invisible fingerprints. The charges took 4 minutes to read. Racketeering, tax evasion, bribery of federal officials, money laundering, conspiracy to commit fraud. Each count was supported by documents bearing his signature, by financial records that told a story of systematic corruption, by evidence so overwhelming that his attorney would later tell him there was no point in going to trial. As they loaded him into the vehicle, Caleb caught sight of a woman standing at the edge of the perimeter, her dark coat familiar even at this distance. Nora watched the arrest with the same clinical detachment she'd shown at their lake meeting, bearing witness to the final chapter of a story she'd written entirely in her own hand. Then she turned and walked away, and Caleb understood that he would never see her again. 3 hours later, Nora sat in a conference room in downtown Manchester, surrounded by attorneys and corporate officers who'd been thoroughly vetted over the past 6 months. The documents in front of her represented the final transition. Rourke Logistics LLC, restructured as a fully legitimate international shipping and supply chain management firm, with all criminal elements excised like tumors and all remaining assets held in her name alone. She signed each page with the same precision she'd used to build the empire, to dismantle Caleb's illusions, to ensure her own survival. When the final signature was complete, she closed the folder and looked out the window at the Manchester skyline, the city that had belonged to her husband now belonging to no one but itself. "Mrs. Rourke," her lead attorney said carefully, "what would you like to do with the Portsmouth dock property? It's still in legal limbo with the federal seizure." "Let them have it," Nora said. "I'm moving the operations to Montreal. Better infrastructure, less oversight, more opportunities for legitimate expansion." She'd already purchased the facility, already hired the staff, already established the partnerships that would make Rourke Logistics, her logistics company, a legitimate player in international shipping. Everything Caleb had built through violence and intimidation, she was rebuilding through intelligence and strategy, and this time there would be no criminal exposure, no federal investigations, nothing but a business that succeeded because it was run by someone who understood that real power didn't announce itself with threats. If you believe intelligence beats intimidation every time, hit that subscribe button. Only people who excuse betrayal and underestimate women won't. That evening, Nora stood on a balcony overlooking Lake Winnipesaukee, the same water where she'd given Caleb his final answers. She held a glass of wine she'd selected herself, wore clothes she'd chosen for her own taste rather than his approval, and breathed air that felt different now that she was free from the weight of making a violent man feel powerful. Her phone buzzed with a message from her new head of security, a former federal agent she'd recruited with a salary that reflected actual market value rather than loyalty extracted through fear. "Border security confirmed. Montreal facility is secure. Ready for your arrival Friday." Nora responded with a simple acknowledgement, then deleted the message and watched the last light fade from the winter sky. Somewhere in a federal holding facility, Caleb was beginning to understand what 20 years in prison actually meant. Somewhere in a small apartment, Vera was beginning to understand what it meant to face consequences without family money to soften the blow. And here, in the quiet sovereignty of her own existence, Nora Rourke was beginning to understand what it meant to live a life that belonged entirely to herself. Built by her intelligence, secured by her planning, untouchable by anyone who'd ever underestimated what a quiet woman could accomplish when she finally stopped making other people feel powerful and started claiming the power that had always been hers. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button. The next story promises to be more exciting.